Of course, the last point about young farmers is pretty passionate to me. This is my daughter up here. She graduated from milking a goat to milking a cow. So that was like trainer wheels. Yeah, like our farm, I suppose, was established in 1923 by my great-grandfather John as a soldier settlement block. And so for the better part of, I don't know, 30 years, he and my grandfather Jack had the job of clearing the land and making it available for agriculture. So there's a lot of hard yakka back in the old days. Just a quick question, how long do I have to talk? Okay. I'll try to cover as much as I can because there's that much going on. So that's the background, and they used to do a lot of work with, the old style dual kind of, cutting chainsaws, because they didn't have chainsaws in their day, right? And then they'd block and tackle like one stump to the other to pull it out of the ground. And then of course, once a year they'd have an inspection because it was under lease, and someone from the agricultural department would come around and sort of do an assessment on how they were doing, and then they'd have to justify, whether the lamb season was going well, if they were producing enough wool in order to keep the lease, And I think it was sometime in the 50s that they finally gained title to the place. So that was a big relief, I suppose, because, you put that many years of work into to developing a place, and, suddenly, you have the opportunity to have the security of knowing that you're going to be there. And so my great-grandfather John went to World War I and was gassed in France. So he only lasted until the 20s, and so for the better part of 50 or 60 years, the farm was actually operated by my grandfather. My only regret in life really was that at the time, just before he died, I was a vegetarian of all things, and he would look at me and go, what's the story with this? But he died before I took over the farm, which I really wish that he'd had known that, the farm had become multi-generational. So I'm fourth generation, and this one I'm expecting will definitely be fifth generation because, she won't go out, without wearing manure. So what I'll do is I'll give a brief overview of what we do on the farm and the different enterprises that we run, and then some of where the inspiration comes from. The first thing that happened when I came back onto the farm, I had a career in IT and graphic design in Sydney, and I came back to the farm just after my grandfather was hauled off the farm. He'd had his fourth heart attack or something, and he refused to leave, so my dad had to get a block and tackle and haul him into town, And the first thing that he did was set up a market garden in the backyard, and then plastered the farmhouse, well, not the farmhouse, but the suburban house with pictures of the farm, Once you become that steeped in farming, you're like kind of welded to it, it never gets out of your blood. And so I came onto the farm in 2005, just a couple of years after Grandpa died, and that was in the middle of the 10-year drought, and the place really looked in poor condition, and I had these memories as a kid of like rolling down the hills with the grass, like, well, it was probably about here, but it felt like it was about here. And all I saw was just barren ground, like, there was almost no grass at all, and the cattle and everything was suffering. So I hadn't yet decided to become a farmer. I thought I'd try gardening, but then I realized that I'm not a good gardener. And the wood-end growing season is about the time it takes from when the horses jump out of the gates of the Melbourne Cup, and by the time they reach the first furlong, everything's gone to seed. So I tried my hand at gardening for the first year and then thought, no, couch grass doesn't go very well with gardening, especially with garden beds built up. So I started looking at the border landscape, and I thought, maybe I'll give it a go. And so over the next couple of years, I started looking for intelligence in terms of how to heal the land so that I could bring it back to that memory that I had as a child of rolling down the hill in the grass. And so began an extraordinary adventure of meeting some very remarkable people from all around the world. In 2010, I co-originated an organisation called RegionAg. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. There was a group of four of us, the Heenan Dohertys, Free Range Permaculture, Milkwood Permaculture, and myself. And at the inaugural meeting, we sort of sat down and asked each other, why were we doing this? And it was going to be a series of workshops where we brought in international experts and we had them on farm for 3-day workshops. And my response was, since I'd heard of this guy called Joel Salatin, that I just wanted to have him come out to my farm, because, getting Joel off the farm is like getting Grandpa with a block and tackle. Like, it's hard to get, he loves his farm, he just like to go down the road. And I said, I just want to get him out to the farm to tell me what I'm doing wrong. And so we went through a sequence of workshops. We covered compost tea making, biofertilizers that were developed in New Mexico, and Mexico rather. We did grazing management, holistic grazing management, and we did keyline design, and we also did seminars with Joel Salatin. And what was most striking to me was that almost all of the present alumni of most of the farmers markets that are in my area now actually met in 2010 in my shed for the first time. And that was like a great, looking back at that now, I realized that that event meant more to actually have the farmers start talking to each other than the information that was supplied. And of course, many people took this information on and started going for it. But the one thing that really struck me and became a driving motivator in what I was doing was that despite the fact that Joel Salatin, is anyone familiar with Joel Salatin? Yep, a few hands, okay. Time magazine called him the world's most innovative farmer. He's now worldwide. I mean, Alan Nation of the Stockman's Grass Farm described him as single-handedly creating the North American pastured poultry movement. He's a pretty cool guy. And so I suppose once that happened, inside of the seminars, there was a kind of facial expression that was going on, like a little bit like yours, right. And this is not to be offensive, but the point being is that persistently every time Joel would raise, "You can do it," the audience in the workshops said, "There's no way we could do that in Australia. There's no way." They just wouldn't let us do it. And that really sort of became this kind of, burning focal point for me to say, right, I'm going to prove it. You actually can do it. And so, a Herculean effort was followed by, after those workshops, of setting the entire suite of multi-speciated, multi-stacked enterprises on the farm, which in our case is cattle, which are moved daily, forested pigs, which are moved every 14 days, broiler meat birds, which are moved in mobile pens. And incidentally, I've actually brought one of my pens down, and I can demonstrate it. It's Mach 2, and it's as light as a feather. And my only concern was using 6,000 kilos of strap downs to make sure this thing didn't blow off the back of the truck when I was driving down. And of course, I didn't realize that I had to go on a 4-lane freeway at one point, and I was driving like this, because I was just outside the legal limit, for the width of this thing. And anyway, so we're going to have a look at that later on, because my argument for the big events we had with Joel Salatin just recently was that the best thing that came out of it was a lightweight broiler pen, because my original ones were made of, in more or less the same way they do at Polyface, but they were clad with my grandfather's 1950s Japanese, corrugated iron, which, is about this thick. And so to move one of these pens was a lot of work. And so we have a fleet now of 14 pens for broiler meat birds. We have 2 A-frame skid-based eggmobiles. We have 2 train-based wheeled eggmobiles. But what, in my naivety in 2010, when I said, oh yeah, we can do it, I had yet to encounter the bureaucracy. Now, I won't linger too long on this, but it was described to me just recently in the workshops with Joel Salatin that we ran last few weeks, was that Masson Ranges Shire Council is the second hardest council to deal with. Now, I actually haven't found that to be the case. I've found that, through connecting with them, by respecting them and going through the process, The only trouble was that we had a planning overlay. 20 years ago, rural conservation zoning was put over the top of the farm. And so that basically meant that I wasn't allowed to have more than 2 animals on 400 acres, unless I had a permit, or existing land rights usage. So here I was going through the archives trying to find a photo of my grandpa with a pig, my grandfather with a chicken, and my grandfather with a dairy cow and whatever. And so that began a process, and I mean, the council had full support. Since Joel's had 3 residential visits to the farm in the last 3 years, stayed on farm with me. And you know, the wisdom that's been gleaned, like, you know, from this farmer has been extraordinary. And so each iteration of his, like, you know, arrival, there's always a new idea that improves things, which is great. So yeah, so that, I mean, we had 700 people on a tour. I think when was this, last Sunday? I don't even know what day it is. Like, I'm a farmer, like, you know, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And we did 3 back-to-back 2-day hands-on workshops with him. So we trained farmers, and there was a great temptation in 2010 to continue as a training organisation because it's very cash flow positive. But the one thing that I wanted to commit to was making sure that I wasn't telling anybody anything that I wasn't doing that was working. So that's part of the integrity side of things. So we hadn't run any workshops until then. But so the general gist of our farm is that it's laid out and set up in such a way that everything always moves. So it's an exercise in biomimicry. I argue that the boundary fence of the landscape was the single pivotal change in the capacity of livestock to function in their natural biological way, because they can't get out. And so, you know, if they had their chance, like the cows, for example, would, you know, mob stock together into a huge herd and then just, you know, meander their way across the landscape, doing their job. But in order to achieve that, we use high-tech, lightweight, portable infrastructure like electric fencing spools, single strand. We have this fantastic stuff called FeatherNet, which is extraordinary. It can keep foxes out and chickens in. So we use that. Pigs are the easiest to fence. You know, it only takes 2 strands of wire, and I'm kind of sadistic like that. I like training young pigs to electric fences. And so you'll put them in a solid enclosure, and then you'll run a hot wire through. And then, of course, their interface with the electric fence is either the snout or the rear end. And they've got really good memories. Let me tell you, so you hear the first squeal, you know, and you know that then, you know, the pigs are right to go out there. And so we usually just use 2 strands of low wire to keep the pigs in. But we orchestrate the movements of everything around the farm so that we are massaging the landscape so that each year it's getting better and better and better. And the changes we've seen since 2005 have been utterly extraordinary. And so we have a long-term vision on the farm for transforming its fertility. And whilst I respect and understand that many farmers believe that inputs are required, on our place we try to make our inputs actually our products. So, for example, you can fertilise a pasture with superphosphate, or you can take chickens and have them fertilise your pasture, and you can sell the eggs. So you're actually you're in a cash positive position. The farm isn't really exactly where I want it to be yet. I'll just make sure I don't stand in front of that. So I'll sort of meander around the way, and I'll show you a few photos. I don't know which order they are in. I never really prepare for these things. I'm always out of my, I'm out of my environment unless I'm doing a farm tour. This is one thing I just talk about, brooding, because we'll relate to the pen over here. So we brood day-old chicks, hens and broilers, in a brood house, and then they go out to pasture and move persistently around the place. I'll just flip through to give you a general impression of some of the things that are going on. If we go, and so Farm tours. Okay, so this has been extraordinary. After 2012, in 2012, I just sort of had this crazy idea. Heen and Doherty were bringing Joel Salatin out to the farm, and I did a deal with them where they could, run workshops on the farm in exchange for a couple of days of Joel's time. And I had my interns sitting around the table, and everyone's sitting there, and I said, you know what? I'm going to get 1,000 people to come to the farm over 2 days. And they all sort of looked at me and went, what? You know, are you nuts? And we registered 1,200 and end up with about 950 or so over 2 gigantic workshops. And then this is where the connectedness of things really comes into it. See, once I established the production models, and that is mob-stocked cattle, daily moved, followed by egg-mobiled chickens. See, that's a pasture sanitization way, so the cows will move forever away from their affluent, and then you bring the egg-mobiles in, and the chickens are completely free range, and they just basically scratch through all the cow pies and sanitize the pasture so that when the cows return, you know, the pastures don't have any pathogens. So you've eliminated worming then. And because, as Joel jokes, when you do a system like that, it just confuses the pathogens, because the pathogens of the chickens are different from the pathogens of the cow, and they don't cross over, and there's no biological problem there. And it is what happens in broader natural landscapes anyway. If you think of, a large herd of bison on the American plains, they're always followed by flocks of birds that come in there and make the most of the fly larvae and the bugs and the beetles and everything else. And so inside this boundary fence, we've established a system of moving animals around in such a way that it orchestrates building of fertility by stacking the enterprises. So you might have, cows on 1 acre, but you've also got then chickens on 1 acre. Or you could put broilers on the same acre at a different time of the year, and all of these things, come together. And so, coming from the IT thing to the farm, I had the capital to spend a couple of years building up this system. I had a couple of years of dispute actually with my father. Like, we finally resolved it because he just finished replacing all of the traditional fences that Grandpa had, right? And I started pulling them all down. And doing these key line, water harvesting roads and everything. And so in that time, after Joel arrived, I started doing farm tours myself. Now, that was a picture of one of them. What was extraordinary was how interested the public had become in finding their source of food. I expected, maybe 20 or 30 people would come to these tours, but I set a whole year of scheduled farm tours and continued in the following year. And over those 2 years, we've had 3,000 people walk the farm. But what was interesting was once I had established the value and the benefit of farming in this ecologically complementary way, in other words, not swimming upstream, then I suddenly realised that, okay, well, if I'm going to be a professional farmer, I need to make some money from this. And so if I really want to be able to, do the sort of land massage, because landscape is like, it's a little bit like your own personal fitness. And so I gave Joel the term the other day that a farmer is a landscape personal trainer. So the idea is that you lift a heavy weight, like let's say you're working out, so you're lifting really heavy weights, but you've got to have a rest day, in order for your muscles to build strength. And it works exactly the same way with the landscape. So we will disturb the landscape very briefly and then allow it long recovery times so that it can build up its strength. So there's an analogy. There's all these kinds of interesting analogies. And so in order to get the level of livestock that I required, the first obvious thing was, I have to connect the people to the farm because I need to have people patronising my regenerative land practices. And so then I went, all right, okay, this is just after Joel in 2012. I said, all right, okay, so I'll put the word out there, and I'll see if anybody's interested in what we call these metropolitan buying clubs. And to my complete astonishment, in 2 weeks we registered 1,700 people in buying clubs all across Melbourne. And I was like, uh-oh. I had to shut it down because the admin just putting the emails into a spreadsheet became so onerous, and the number was so completely overwhelming. So 1,700 people in 2 weeks. If I'd left it open, by now I'd have half a million people. And then of course the problem became, well, we weren't quite ready. And so I thought I could just throw up a shed, start selling produce, no problems. Then the bureaucrats. And so I called the bureaucrats in 2012, and I said, is it okay if I have a farm shop? And they said, well, that depends. And I said, well, what does it depend on? And they said, well, it depends on if the produce leaves the farm and then comes back again. And I'm like, well, there's a cow. It's got to go to the abattoir and come back again. And they were like, oh, no, you can't do that. It's impossible. You could grow a tomato and you could sell that. That would be all right if it didn't leave the property. So I sort of got this kind of cold sweat moment where I was like, uh-oh, maybe the people in the shed in 2010 were right. So what I decided to do was to build a gigantic network of supporters with the intent of establishing a measure of clout, so that if I wanted to do and follow this dream of connecting all these pieces together, I'd have the support to do it. Now, it happened partly organically and partly through my former career in graphic design, but we were putting on 1,000 followers on our Facebook page a month in those 2 years, now up to 25,000 people, which is just outrageous. So I can call a monthly farm tour, for example, and 150 people will just register like that. And so the greatest cricket bat that I had in dealing with the council was that whilst they were denying me the capacity to sell off the farm, direct market, which is what I really wanted to do, because I believe in people walking the landscape, seeing how it's done, personal inspection. We calculated that we had contributed between $1.5 to $2 million in local business contribution, because the people couldn't actually buy anything from me. So they'd come to the tour, they'd have their fantastic day, and then they'd go down and buy a vanilla slice, or a pair of shoes, or get a haircut, or whatever it was. And so that was very interesting. I'm just going through a few things here. I'll just throw up a few photos. So then, of course, the council approached me, the economics development manager, and said, look, we're going to pave the way for you, because this rural conservation zoning doesn't allow you to do anything. In fact, even the planning guy came to the place, and he was totally supportive, but he said, you need a permit for everything. And the worst part was when I had my Lucas Mill. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Lucas Mill. All right. I'm not allowed to move a fallen tree without a permit. And so I knew the moment, I was trying to distract him as we were walking past it. And I could see he was looking at the side, and he knew the cool factor. It's like, mills are cool. And it's the ultimate boy's toy and girls' toy. Like, girls love it as much, but my joke is that you've got to have a toothpick, on standby, because you've got to get the sawdust out of your teeth from grinning so much, when you're cutting out these logs. And so all of the structures, with the exception of the broiler shelters that we have out here, have been built with the mill off fallen trees or harvested trees from the property. Now, that's carbon sequestration, because our forest is a monoculture of messmate, and it's basically canopy locked, very unhealthy, and needs management. And so sooner or later, it's going to burn. And in 2009, it did start burning. And so for every one of those trees that I harvest with my mill, I'm stabilising the timber into something that is cool. Now this is a good one here, more bureaucrats. Okay, so this is the, it's sort of hard to see here, but that's the A-frame there. And I did an irrigation trial. See those green spots? So as we move the A-frame, for those unfamiliar with the A-frame, there'll be a picture that comes up of it. It's a triangular truss-based structure of about 9 metres long by 5.5 metres wide. It's the ultimate hen-keeping mobile structure ever. And 5 minutes? Only 5 minutes? Oh my God, okay, I'm gonna run fast, okay. So I'll get to the big picture. I'll just throw a couple more pictures up. Maybe you'll see a closer version of it. There's a classic in here somewhere. Well, this is the A-frame and the construction. Okay, so it's a skid-based system. So 9 meters long, 5.5, and completely milled off the Lucas mill. So I would get a stack of saw logs and I'd just cut whichever dimension I needed to put it together. And there's nothing more satisfying than turning a tree into something like that. And this, if you were to visit the farm, this thing is epic. We have 2 of them now. And I knew as soon as I parked it in the front paddock, I'd start to get a lot of local interest, because it was like they'd be driving down the road and then suddenly there's a building in the middle of the paddock. And then they drive down a couple of days later and it had moved. It's like, what's going on over there? And so, yeah, that's the general picture. So what we're doing here is not so much leveraging social media, but what we're doing is we're wanting to invite people to have an open door policy. Now, the greatest thing that has happened most recently, which is I call 2014 the year of the bureaucrat for me, and it's over. I mean, we're still getting a permit every week, but for everything. But we have now a farm shop. We can't call it a farm shop. It's actually a rural produce distribution centre, or something like that. That might be allowed to sell postcards. But what's exciting about it is that it's divided into 2 halves. The first half is a presentation room that allows us to do our monthly tours and bring people through the shop after they've gone on the tour to sell them produce. And the back end of the shop is near on being registered as a commercial boning room, or butchery shop, basically. And so we're very fortunate where we are in our location. Our cows only have to travel 12 kilometres to the local abattoir to be slaughtered. The pigs are going a little further to Laverton, and so they get slaughtered off-site and brought back. But we do also have a permit for a shipping container that's going behind the shed, which we'll install and have fitted out as a mobile, not a mobile, but a stationary, super small scale chicken processing facility for the meat birds, which is the broiler pen that you'll see out here later on. And so what we're trying to do is we see ourselves as being the tip of the sword of breaking. If we can manage this in Australia's second most difficult council area, then that's just going to open up the doors, because there's a precedent set on people having the basic right to choose where they buy their food, because there is a lot of pressure on farmers, and they make it really difficult for us. But one great development that happened out of Joel Salatin's recent visit is that I attended a conference with some very important people or players in the area that are looking at establishing what's called the Farmer to Consumer Legal Defence Fund. And so for about $125 annual membership, if you ever have any strife, you can basically get on a hotline and speak to a lawyer immediately. And so, for example, in the raw milk fiasco thing with Mount View Farm, they didn't know what to do. And of course, as it's turned out, that story was so far from accurate it wasn't funny, but it almost destroyed that farm. And had there been a fund, for farmers, and basically the right of a person to choose where they buy their food and what food they want to eat. And so that was extremely exciting, and the genesis of that is now in full swing. There's so much more I could tell you about the farm. First 11 of these were built with the old tin. Yeah. And the first thing that was obvious is that we had to go with aluminium. Now, it was slightly more expensive to buy, but the weight difference between the old pens and the new ones is just beyond imagination. So we raise broilers in here, which are meat birds. They're either the Ross or the Cobb variety. They're fast-growing, double-breasted, very big birds. And when you put them on pasture, I mean, if you think of a confinement shed, you know, with no light, my plumber just recently told me that like he used to work in one of those, and they had tiny little holes in the concrete deep litter wall, and all the chickens would be sort of like just desperately trying to get some daylight. Where this thing is adaptable, you can change the lid from one side to the other depending on which orientation you've got it, and it's got you know, a fully clad back end. The newest, coolest innovation, which applies to the Australian climate, is that we've split the back panel in half so that if it's a hot day, we can take off one of those panelings and there's chicken wire behind it, so you get a cross breeze. The mistake that most people make about building these, you know, after they've been inspired to sort of do this system, is that they either build them too heavy or they build them too light. So they build them out of steel, or they'll build them out of poly, and they'll blow away in the wind. But so we brood chickens in a brooder. I wish I had brought down like an example of a LPG gas brooder. But small scale starting is very simple. Like if you have a cutout corrugated iron tank 600 high, you throw some wood shavings in there. You can use a halogen lamp if you like as a heat lamp. I wouldn't recommend that because there's a story I could tell you behind it, but we don't have time for that. The best thing to do is to you know, get a 45 litre gas bottle, one heat lamp, and a rat-proof room if you can, or figure out a way to do it. But they're very easy to raise, so long as they get a good start in life. So they spend between 2 and 3 weeks in the brooder under a heat lamp as they're brought in as day olds, and then they're brought into the pens out here. On the first day, we lay hay down on the ground so that we harden them off as well. It's like growing a tomato. You know, you want to sort of harden it off before you know, take it out in the environment. And so the chickens progressively go from, you know, full warmth at about 30 degrees on average, and over time we start turning the heat lamp down until they get nights where they're more you know, like the experience is going to be out in pasture. So every day we move these, and that's why it's so important this thing is light. And so the process is quite simple. You roll the dolly under there, and the dolly's wheels are 8 inches, which means they're set at a height that's unlikely to allow the small chicks to get out. And I've simulated a bucket of water, so the bucket of water holds the lid down, and it's connected to this Plasson Bell waterer, so everything's very easily accessible. Excuse me, is it still working? Yep. So we can either switch lids depending on which way the sun goes. So like, for example, if we're going in a direction where we want to have morning light, we can have this one over there, or vice versa. And then to move it, it's quite simple and extremely lightweight. So you just move it along. And it takes about 3 days for the chicks to get the idea of this. So the first day you sort of just go like this a little bit, and like this a little bit. And then once they're in the program, like because you're providing them with fresh pasture, like they just run for it, right? So they're all in the front, there's no problem at all. And then you'll just move it one length. Okay, now if this was my old broiler pen, I'd be like, so this thing has been you know, the best thing since sliced bread. Well, sliced bread isn't even that good. This is even better. So it's a very simple structure. I can't take off the back, but you can sort of see the front here. If I take the lid off. So servicing involves, we run fleets of these. So they're staggered across the pasture like a bomber fleet. And we run them so that the chickens that are at the lower, that are the front of the fleet are at the lowest side of the slope. So that as you move them forward, if it rains, the affluent from the chickens doesn't wash over the pasture and you know, otherwise contaminate the other chickens. But so if we have a fleet of these, we'll move all of them first. We'll take the feeders out, place the feeders on the lid here. I'll just completely take this lid off so you can see. And hold that. I'll just get it out of the way. Actually, it just doesn't weigh anything. Okay. So it's just a braced structure that essentially consists of treated pine, and this whole structure was built with 3 6-metre lengths of 6 by 1 inch boards. And we threw this together during one of the workshops in probably about 45 minutes after we pre-ripped the timber.
Ben, you're going to wind it up for me, and I'm going to allow 2 people to have questions.
Okay.
And then we've got to get on to Rod.
All right.
All right.
Well, you're welcome to have a look at this and take photos of the design and everything. The one important difference of the dimensions is that the front and the rear 2x4 ripped down the middle, so they're 2x2, so they can take the weight of the dolly over here. That's the important point. Otherwise, the thing will sort of come apart. And also the wire that goes through the centre stops it from bowing out. So they're incredibly durable. And the main takeaway point is that in one of these, in 8 weeks, you could probably raise about 150 kilograms of chickens. So a small block, this is what a small block, big ideas.
That's it.
Okay, so what's that? Oh, I wouldn't put 90, about 75. Yeah, and 75 chickens in this would occupy the feeder area in one quadrant at 8 weeks. Otherwise, they just wander. They're a big couch potato, kind of like chickens. You get pug dogs and everything else. Weird things. Those are the only ones we can get really in Australia. If we were to do heritage breeds, we have to pay $12 for a day old, and it might take 5 times the time to grow it out. And by the time we finish, it'd be like a $60 bird. My answer to that would be that if you were to look at poultry production in general, you might run less meat bird pens because they only require, these birds will have 90 linear meters of pasture in their lifetime. So, when people talk about density, they're actually getting a hell of a lot of area. But you might look into doing layers with an A-frame skid-based structure, because it's almost impossible to tip one of those because their center of gravity is like smack bang in the middle, and so they can go on quite steep slopes. And there's been all sorts of variations of that particular design being put out there. So, okay, well, we've done. The short answer to that is that we've had successful fleets run with these and had no fox problems at all. Because what we usually do is we have a whole bunch of these things lying around like bits and pieces of timber, and we just chock underneath any of the gaps. Now, we did have one season where we did have a problem, and you know what foxes are like, they're kind of psychotic. If a fox got in, it would take out the entire pen. There might be one scared chicken at the back. So what we do now is we employ the same feather net, electronet that I was talking about. So around the A-frames, we have 50-metre lengths. There's 2 50-metre lengths around our present A-frames. And the entire thing weighs about 5 or 6 kilos, I think, and can be pulled down and reconstructed in less than 10 minutes for 100 metres. Electric netting, yeah. And so with the broiler pens, when they're a fleet orientation, we usually use about 4 or 5 lengths so that we sort of have the diagonal, and we haven't lost a single chicken. Yeah. And that runs off a small battery energizer of about 2 joules, so it's not a very big energizer. It's got to make sure the battery's charged, and you've always got a battery on charge. Yeah, I've got a Marima, but I knew nothing about raising dogs, and so she protects the back doormat, and loves people. It loves people, Yeah.
Look, everyone, please thank Ben for his time today. It's been fantastic.
You're welcome. Well, I hope you've got something out of it, because I think in small, you can run these in orchards. You can run them on small acreage. You can run them in a circle. You don't have to have a fleet, but you could have a chest freezer, and you could fill your chest freezer with the most amazing pastured chicken imaginable. Because I can tell you right now, there's a world of difference between pastured chicken and organic chicken, or whatever you want to call it, in a tiny packet that you buy from the supermarket. So, and it's easy to get started. So,
well, thank you so much, Ben.
You're most welcome.
On to the next. We've got a full program for the day, but Ben's hanging around, and he'll be here for the forum this afternoon. So if you didn't get a chance to ask your question, don't forget you've got the box to put your questions in, or keep it for the forum this afternoon.
Okay, great.
So let's move all back inside, and we'll hear from Rod.
Okay.